Hello, my name is Sam Feltham and welcome to Expert Interviews here on Smash the Fat. With me today is my first guest in this week of Whether Do Calories Count debate, and it's a real honour to have him on the show. I'm a regular reader of his blog, wholehealthsource.org. With me is Dr. Stephan Guyenet, all the way from University of Washington. How are you doing, Stephan?
Doing well, thanks. How are you, Sam?
All good. And I pronounced Guyenet correctly, did I?
Guyenet.
Guyenet. Not quite. I was so close. Guyenet. Sorry, mate. Sorry. So, as I mentioned there, kind of in your introduction, you're an obesity researcher, as well as being a neurobiologist and author of a good book that I've had quite a flick through myself. Why do we gain fat and how do we lose it? Now there are sort of some other books that are kind of similarly titled but a slightly different take on their analysis on the research. So before we kind of get into the nitty gritty of all of that, let's start off with kind of your background of how you became an obesity researcher and why you wanted to become an obesity researcher as well.
Sure. So, I think there was really little doubt for most of my life, even starting in childhood, that I was going to become a researcher of some sort. I always had an inclination in that direction. And in college, I studied biochemistry with the idea that I was going to use it as a foundation to become a neurobiologist. And so for graduate school, I became a neurobiologist. I wasn't really sure what field I wanted to go into, what field of neurobiology at the time, because it was just so wide open to me. But that's what I really appreciate about neurobiology is it's really the last great frontier in the biological sciences, the last frontier that we still know so little about. And it's also the organ that makes us who we are as human beings and as individuals more than anything else. So in graduate school, I studied neurodegenerative disease, and I kind of ended up deciding that the disease I was studying was too rare to really have much impact on human health, and I wanted to do something that had a greater impact on more people, greater positive impact, hopefully.
Absolutely.
And so I went to obesity research, and it really, it sounds like a big leap going from neurodegenerative disease to obesity research, but it's actually not. Obviously there are differences, but neurobiology is really very central to obesity, and so it was actually a pretty easy transition. I already had the foundation of neurobiology, so moving into the neurobiology of obesity was really a pretty painless move. And I had already been quite interested in obesity by that time. I think, I wasn't studying it professionally, but I was reading a lot about it, and I certainly recognized how important it is, both to health and just to well-being. I think it's the obesity epidemic is something that weighs very heavily on the psyche of the United States and the UK as well, and globally many different countries. So I did 4 years as a postdoc in the lab of Mike Schwartz at the University of Washington. Mike is an internationally renowned obesity researcher, and I had a really nice productive postdoc there, studying the parts of the brain that determine how much fat you carry and what changes occur to those parts of the brain as obesity develops. So, and here I am today.
Hey, voila! Awesome.
Yep.
As you were kind of mentioning there towards the end, your research is kind of mainly in how the central nervous system interacts with one's body fat, basically, and how that kind of regulates body fat.
Mm-hmm.
So can you explain to us, in your opinion, what causes obesity and what can we do to kind of reverse it?
Yeah, I think that obesity is not caused by one thing. I think
Absolutely.
it's, as with any complex uh, phenomenon, it probably has many different causes. Some of those are probably more important in some people than others, and depending on the situation. But essentially, I think the main factors are the food that we're eating, the physical activity level that we have, and then other aspects of lifestyle like the amount of sleep that we get, the amount of stress that we get, uh, the food environment. I think the food environment really is probably the number one cause.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, I think food quality does make a big difference, but imagine if you had to walk 3 miles and climb a tree every time you wanted to get a bacon cheeseburger. You probably wouldn't eat a lot
Absolutely.
of bacon cheeseburgers, and you probably would be leaner, or not you personally, but hypothetical person would probably be leaner.
Hmm.
And if you think about it, that's what our ancestors had to do when we were hunter-gatherers. Getting food was a physically demanding process, and even when we were agriculturalists, our more recent ancestors, if you want to eat a hamburger bun, you got to grow the wheat. It's kind of a lot of work. So, um, and the fact now that we're surrounded by highly calorie dense, extremely inexpensive, very tempting foods, I think that's a big part of it right there. These foods are all around us. They're very easy to get. They taste good. They deliver a large number of calories. And so, for a variety of reasons, we kind of passively overeat food. It's not that we're sitting down and planning to overeat, but the way that our food environment is structured and how that interacts with our kind of ancient hardware, our ancient brain hardware, just kind of promotes overeating. We're kind of fundamentally, humans are opportunistic eaters. If you look at hunter-gatherers, there are many accounts of hunter-gatherers eating just jaw-dropping quantities of food when they come across a windfall.
Hmm.
So, to some extent, I think we're wired to eat food when it's available, and now it's available all the time. But I do think it's more complicated than that. It's not just passive overeating leading to obesity, and the reason I say that is because body fat is regulated. It's regulated by the brain. It's not just a passive process. So we do have a food environment that kind of like pushes at the upper bounds of our regulatory system all the time. But we also have this regulatory system that's attempting to constrain that
Hmm.
that fat mass. And so what you see in obesity is that fat regulatory system in the brain is defending a higher level of body fat. So something about our diet and lifestyle has caused the brain to start defending a higher level of body fat. So if you take a lean person whose brain is defending a lean level of body fat and you try to overfeed that person, they're not going to gain very much weight. This has been shown many times. Their body will literally burn off the excess calories up to a certain point at least.
Hmm.
And so for obesity to occur, you either need to have someone who has a system that's very weak, which I think is the case in some instances, or that system has to be reset to a higher level. So I think it's a combination of changes in regulation and just the fact that we're living in an environment that naturally promotes in many different ways increases in calorie intake, decreases in calorie expenditure. And by the way, just to make this explicit, I do think it boils down to calories in and calories out. So there are many different things that can affect calories in and calories out. And I think this is where people get mixed up is they think, you know, for example, overfeeding studies, people don't necessarily gain as much weight as you might predict. Well, it turns out that your energy expenditure goes up during overfeeding. So, but all that can be accounted for by the calories entering and the calories leaving. It's just that the relationship between those two is more complicated than it's often made out to be. So it's not just a passive result of calories that you eat and going for a jog. It's a lot more complicated than that. But ultimately, the amount of fat on your body is determined by the number of calories entering versus the number leaving.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no way to deny that from kind of my perspective in terms of the fact that that's the physics of the matter. But as you were kind of going into there, like all the biochemical drivers, whether that be in sort of driving your body to perhaps overeat and particular types of foods as well to overeat as well as just your body wanting to store more fat. Now, sort of many of maybe your critics or just skeptics of kind of like calories in, calories out often talk about a hormone called insulin, and you don't necessarily think that insulin plays a major role in obesity at all. So what's kind of your point of view on that?
Yeah, so I don't want to say that insulin plays no role because, you know, actually when you, in the introduction, when you were mentioning that you believe that leptin and insulin resistance play a role in obesity, I actually agree with that. I agree with both of those. But I think it's important to make a distinction because, for example, you know, the insulin hypothesis of obesity that Gary Taubes, for example, supports, he's not saying insulin resistance causes obesity. He's saying elevated insulin and increased insulin action causes obesity. Because insulin resistance is reducing the insulin signal, right? Insulin resistance is you can't hear it as well. So, the point I want to make briefly about that before moving on is that should I explain leptin really quick, or do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the way this body fat regulatory system works in the brain is your fat tissue produces a hormone called leptin in proportion to its size. Leptin enters your circulation, and then it's detected by your brain, in particular, a region of the brain called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus regulates your body fat stores by regulating everything in your body that relates to body fatness and energy demanding processes. So your hypothalamus regulates your appetite, your hypothalamus regulates your interest in food, your hypothalamus regulates your sympathetic nervous system, which influences how many calories your body is burning at rest. It influences your thyroid hormone because it controls the pituitary and thyroid stimulating hormone. Basically, anything you can think of. It controls reproduction. So if you don't have enough body fat, it shuts down your menstruation, for example, in women. So basically, the hypothalamus is the master controller of stuff relating to how much energy you have in your body. And it's pretty well worked out, in at least to a pretty large extent, how that works, the different circuits and what cells are responding to leptin, etc. But basically what happens is if your body fat goes down, your leptin goes down, your hypothalamus says, hey, what's going on? We're starving here. And then it ramps up all these things that try to get the fat back. So you get hungrier, you start burning less energy, you might start feeling cold because you're not burning enough energy to maintain your temperature. You might feel sluggish, etc. And that continues until your fat comes back, your leptin comes back, and then your hypothalamus doesn't think it's starving. Okay, so just to expand that a little bit, the hypothalamus does not only respond to leptin. So leptin is, as far as we know, it's the most important known regulator of body fatness in mammals. However, the hypothalamus responds to a variety of signals of energy status in the body. So leptin is the most important one, and that's the one that's most directly tied to body fat stores, so most intimately involved in body fat regulation. However, the hypothalamus receives a variety of other signals that are produced, for example, in the gastrointestinal tract that relate to food consumption at an individual meal. So when you eat a meal, it releases certain factors into the circulation, and that can affect your level of satiety, for example. Most of that's through the brainstem. Some of it occurs in the hypothalamus. So the point is that insulin is one of these factors. And so if you, for example, if you knock insulin out of the hypothalamus, you get animals that, or excuse me, insulin receptors. So the hypothalamus can't hear the insulin. You get animals that are a little chubby. If you knock leptin receptors out of the hypothalamus, you get extremely obese animals. So insulin is kind of like leptin's kid brother. It is a feedback signal that says to the hypothalamus, we've got enough energy here, so keep the lights on, basically. So when an animal develops obesity, a rodent certainly, and there's some evidence that this happens in humans. Well, we know that rodents and humans develop leptin resistance, so they can't hear the leptin in the hypothalamus, and that makes the hypothalamus, quote unquote, defend a higher level of body fat. So that the person's body is defending overweight state or defending the obese state. But what also occurs in parallel with that is insulin resistance in the hypothalamus. So in the same way that insulin resistance occurs in your muscle tissue, in your fat tissue, in your many other tissues, your liver, it also occurs in parts of the brain, including the hypothalamus. And so that dampens that feedback signal. And so I would agree that insulin and leptin resistance both play a role, but simply that the mechanism is a bit different than what is typically invoked. And I would say even almost the opposite of what's typically invoked. So getting back to really the main thrust of your question, that was more of a little side note there, but so you're really curious about my take on the idea that like insulin acting on fat cells directly is causing obesity. Is that correct?
That was just, yeah, that's one of the questions, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, all right. Basically, anytime you have a hypothesis like that, really what you want to start doing is asking questions. You start saying, well, what would this hypothesis predict if it were correct? And are those predictions supported by scientific observations? So we can go through the research that's been done and see if those observations are supported. For example, we can say, well, if insulin causes obesity, then we should see that people who don't have a lot of insulin, who are insulin deficient, like a type 1 diabetic, should start losing weight, right? Well, it turns out they do start losing weight. Type 1 diabetics are very, very lean. They lose fat and muscle tissue. They develop severe wasting of both fat and muscle tissue and other tissues as well. And so we say, well, okay, that's interesting. Now let's look at some observational studies and let's see whether elevated insulin predicts fat gain over time. Because that's also a pretty straightforward prediction, right? If your insulin is high, you should gain more weight than someone whose insulin is normal. Well, it turns out that that doesn't happen. There have been many studies on this question, and actually there are more studies showing that high insulin associates with less fat gain over time than there are studies showing the reverse. So you cannot predict the amount of weight someone's going to gain by measuring their insulin over time. So that's kind of now that presents a little bit of a paradox, right? So if we know that insulin can modify body fatness, why is it that it doesn't seem to promote obesity in humans, or at least it doesn't associate with the development of obesity in humans? And so to explain that, we need to think a little bit more about what happens to insulin signaling during the development of obesity. And what we know about insulin is that if you measure the insulin of an obese person, it's very high typically, right? Not always, but typically it's very high.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, kind of part of this hypothesis that the insulin could be causing the obesity. But now, if the hypothesis is that insulin is acting on fat cells to pack fat away, then we should just be able to look at the function of fat stores in obese people, and we should be able to look at insulin sensitive functions and see that they are enhanced if insulin is having an elevated effect. Well, it turns out that if you look at lipolysis from fat tissue, if you look at suppression of lipolysis following a meal, if you look at almost any insulin-dependent function in fat cells in obese people, it's not enhanced, it's suppressed. If anything, it's either normal or suppressed. And the reason is because fat tissue of obese people is insulin resistant. So you have this very high level of circulating insulin, but it's not doing what it would do if a lean person had very high insulin, because those cells are insulin resistant. So even though insulin levels are high, insulin action is not high. Insulin action, if anything, is reduced. So, and I mean, it's very easy to see, because what does insulin do to circulate? Okay, so circulating free fatty acids are basically a marker of how much fat tissue is releasing into the circulation. Free fatty acids are the main bioavailable fat fuel in the blood. It's the one that your cells are going to suck up and oxidize, and it's a direct reflection of how much your fat tissue is releasing. So if this elevated insulin in obesity were inhibiting lipolysis, lipolysis is this release of fatty acids from fat tissue, then you would expect that obese people should have lower free fatty acids. But their free fatty acids aren't low, they're normal or even elevated. So there's really no, I mean, in my view, there are some very simple questions that have not been asked about this hypothesis that are very critical for evaluating it. And once you answer those questions that are very, very basic, it kind of makes it pretty difficult to reconcile that evidence with this hypothesis, in my view. Because, I mean, there are just very basic questions you can ask that test this hypothesis that pretty conclusively undermine it, in my view.
Cool. So kind of when somebody that's lean that becomes type 2 diabetic, for instance, how has that occurred kind of without an overeating action there, for instance?
Yeah, so, well, I'll say first of all that overeating could be involved even in a person who's lean. And I'll also say that it's much, much less common for a lean person to develop type 2 diabetes than for an obese person to do it. A person who is essentially a typical overweight person is something like 40 times more likely to develop diabetes than a person who is very lean like you or I. So it's a huge risk factor. That doesn't mean that it never happens in lean people. It does, but it's much less common. So, and another thing I want to say is that diabetes also makes you leaner. So, often what you'll see is someone will become overweight or obese, and then by the time they get their diabetes diagnosis, they have actually lost some weight. They might not actually be that overweight anymore. That doesn't mean that the excess fat mass they had before didn't contribute to their condition. So, okay, so after those caveats, now I'm going to get to your actual question.
Sure thing, Stephan. Take your time, mate.
What's that?
Take your time, Stephan. It's all good, mate.
So essentially, as with obesity, diabetes is multifactorial. And in fact, one of the really interesting things about diabetes is, and I'm talking specifically about type 2 diabetes here, since that was the question. If you look at the genetic susceptibility factors for type 2 diabetes, they almost all relate to the insulin secreting beta cells in the pancreas. So susceptibility to type 2 diabetes has a lot to do with how your pancreas is constructed. So someone who is obese, very insulin resistant, and has very high levels of fasting insulin, but whose pancreas is very robust, that person their pancreas can keep pumping out insulin to maintain metabolic control as they become more and more insulin resistant. That person is not going to become diabetic. They're just going to have extreme hyperinsulinemia, elevated insulin that is. They're going to have extreme insulin resistance. They're going to maintain metabolic control because their pancreas can secrete sufficient insulin. But some people, when they start becoming insulin resistant, and lean people can be plenty insulin resistant, especially if you're physically inactive. Physical activity has a huge impact on insulin signaling. Cigarette smoking, genetics, those things can have bad sleep hygiene. Those things can have an impact on insulin sensitivity. If you're a lean person and you either got unlucky genetically, or you are sedentary, or you have other factors that are promoting insulin resistance, or even you are overeating but you're just very resistant to obesity genetically, but you're still overloaded with circulating nutrients in your circulation, you can develop insulin resistance. And if your pancreas, if your beta cells cannot compensate for that insulin resistance because they are genetically more susceptible to failure, then you're not going to secrete sufficient insulin, and you're therefore not going to be able to maintain metabolic control over your glucose and fatty acid levels, and then that's called type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what I kind of have a figure on what's kind of going on is that for you it's kind of leptin resistance first, and then would you say it's insulin resistance second, or would you say it's kind of like the mass of the obese person, the fat mass of the obese person second? How would you put those three kind of in a hierarchy of their contribution to somebody retaining or even gaining weight?
Okay, so what were the three? There was insulin resistance, there was leptin resistance, and what was the third?
Just the fat mass itself as well, giving off cytokines and things like
that. Contributing to the tendency to retain more weight in the future? Is that the idea?
Yeah. Or if you don't think that's a part of it, just take it off the table.
No, it could be. It could contribute to leptin and insulin resistance.
Yeah.
But I would say that leptin and insulin resistance probably operate in parallel with one another in the brain.
Right.
At least in the animal models that we work with, when we find leptin resistance, we find insulin resistance in the brain. And it has been shown that insulin resistance makes a significant contribution to the obese state in those animal models that we work with. So leptin is kind of the top dog, but insulin does make a significant contribution. And when you put both of those together, then they exacerbate one another, but they seem to operate in parallel. I mean, I don't know. It's possible that one comes before the other, but certainly there doesn't appear to be a major gap between the two, or at least not that we know of.
Yeah, they definitely kind of work in unison to create this burden, basically. And kind of what I'm getting from you there, Stephan, is that it's almost like it's more of a biochemical imbalance rather than an energy imbalance. Would you say that's fair, or am I way off?
Well, it's both. It's both.
Yeah.
It's I hesitate to use the word biochemistry, biochemical, because that makes me think about enzymes and metabolic pathways. I would say more, cell signaling or neurobiological alterations, but or physiological. But it's both. I mean, the neurobiology and the physiology are driving the energy balance, and that's really it. I was going to say the energy balance is driving the neurobiology and physiology too, but I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, it really boils down to the neurobiology and physiology, because that's anytime you put food into your mouth, anytime you move your body, anytime your body does anything, that's the result of neurobiology and physiology. So that's really the ultimate cause of it all.
Because for me, sort of I kind of teach when I'm talking about this to people kind of face to face. I talk about this biochemical balance that you're trying to create, because as you were kind of saying there, people's sleep, like unhygienic sleep, can kind of cause imbalances through the body, which obviously has a knock-on effect on kind of one's fat mass, along with kind of obviously the leptin resistance and insulin resistance, and kind of just the whole circadian rhythm as a whole. If you kind of knock that out of kilter, then lots of things go wrong metabolically, kind of increased fat mass being one of them, along with lots of other things, including kind of sort of really detrimental cholesterol profiles and things like that. So kind of when I look at things like energy balance, or even just calories and portion size, the only way that they matter for me is their total load on the biochemical reactions going on in the body, because 100 calories of steak or bread will have a smaller effect than 1,000 calories of steak or bread. It's sort of, obviously the portion sizes do matter to a certain degree in terms of their biochemical reaction to it, but it's not necessarily kind of the total calories that you're eating that's kind of making this effect. It's just the total load of biochemical reactions that's going on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
But does it make any sense to you as kind of a scientist, or would you just totally disregard that?
Well, essentially, I guess it comes back down to the question of, is a calorie, right?
I guess so.
And I feel like that question gets defined in a lot of different ways, so I'll define it.
That's right.
Define what I'm going to be discussing right now, and that is the idea that the total number of calories that are absorbed from your food is the sole determinant of the amount of the sole food property that impacts body fatness. So I would say that's the best definition that I can come up with. So it doesn't have anything to do with how healthy the food is, just specifically the impact on body fatness. So essentially, I mean, pretty much any way you slice it, that hypothesis has been upheld by scientific experiments. So, you know, there are studies that vary in quality in the methods that they used and the techniques that they used and the degree of control that they had over the people's diets. But if you specifically look at the very highest quality studies available, they consistently suggest that, as far as we know, the calorie value of food is the only food property that has ever been demonstrated convincingly to impact body fat mass. There's no other food property that's ever been demonstrated to impact body fat mass. So if you look, for example, Rudy Leibel and Michael Rosenbaum, they are some of the leaders in this field, and they've done these incredibly well-controlled studies where they put people who are hospitalized, so they have complete control over their diet. They put them on these basically shakes, these nutritionally controlled shakes where they can very precisely control the what goes into it. And they've done this to 16 people now. They have them, hospitalized in a setting, and they vary their macronutrient intake wildly. So they'll vary it from, 10% carbohydrate to 80% carbohydrate, and they'll do it for months. And it has absolutely no impact on their body weight as long as the calories are controlled. So as long as they're feeding them the same amount of calories that they need to maintain their weight, the amount of carbohydrate and fat makes absolutely no difference in these experiments. And then if you look at the overfeeding studies, it's the same thing. There are 2 that have been published to date that have compared carbohydrate to fat overfeeding. They both found the exact same result, that a high carbohydrate or a high fat diet both led to the exact same amount of fat gain when calories were controlled. So, and this is in, groups of people. It's a randomized controlled trial. So that doesn't mean that one individual might not see differences. It's possible that there's individual variability that's hidden in these studies. But what they do tell us is that for the average person, or at least the average type of person that was included in that study, it doesn't matter whether it's carbohydrate or fat. It's going to lead to the exact same amount of body fat gain when the calories are controlled. But, that being said, so I mean, basically the body, and just to take a step back, if you look at the weight loss studies, it's the same thing. The calories seem to matter. The composition doesn't seem to matter. Doesn't seem to matter what happens to insulin levels. There's no effect independent of calories, as far as we can tell. But that doesn't mean that diet composition doesn't have an impact on body fatness, because we know that it does have an impact on how many calories people eat. So if you look at, for example, the low carbohydrate diet studies, the ones where they've actually accurately quantified food intake, most of them have not accurately quantified food intake. Most of them use what's called a food frequency questionnaire. They ask people how much they ate. People are like, yeah, I ate 200 calories today.
Yeah,
well,
right.
it turns out they didn't. And when you actually accurately measure food intake, you find that basically the changes in calorie intake are consistent with the changes in weight that you see in those studies. So it doesn't undermine the impact of macronutrients or any kind of diet composition factor on body fatness. It just means that calories are part of the causal pathway by which they operate.
And then that leads on to sort of how much how many calories one is going to absorb as well. Is that what you're saying? Because earlier you kind of talked about
Yeah, that's
your
part of it.
definition in terms of how many calories you're actually going to absorb, because that's the most important thing, right? Because if you get rid of all these calories, if you're eating all these calories and you get rid of them sort of through excretion or energy expenditure or whatever, then it doesn't particularly matter the total calories that you're eating. If you see, what matters is the amount that you absorb. Is that what you're
Well,
saying?
yeah, but my definition of absorb was a little more specific than yours.
Yeah.
So when I say absorb, what I mean is from the digestive tract into the
Mm-hmm.
circulation.
Yeah.
So if you're eating a food and half the calories are going into the toilet, obviously that's not going to deliver as many calories as a food that you're completely absorbing the calories from.
Mm-hmm.
But once those calories enter your circulation, it doesn't seem to make any difference whether it's carbohydrate or fat. In terms of, because basically, these studies, they put people on these diets of different macronutrient compositions, and then in the case of the overfeeding studies, they overfeed them by 1,000 calories a day, or 50% in excess of their energy expenditure, which are probably fairly similar quantities. And what they find is that people only retain a fraction of the excess calories no matter what you feed them. So you can't do a simple calculation of, well, a pound of body fat is 3,500 calories, and I just overate 1,000, so I'll be gaining a pound of fat every 3.5 days. It doesn't actually play out like that. So, for example, one of the coolest overfeeding studies that I'm aware of, I'm trying to remember what the guy's name. Oh yeah, Levine. Can't remember his first name, but it's Levine and colleagues. Published in Science in I think the late 90s maybe.
Mm-hmm.
They overfed people, and by I think 1,000 calories a day. So every person got the exact same calorie excess of 1,000 calories a day, and they found tremendous individual variability in the amount of fat those people gained. So there was literally tenfold differences in the amount of fat that people gained. Some people only gained half a pound. Some people gained, or no, half a kilo. Some people gained 5 kilos of fat from the exact same calorie excess. And on average, the average person only retained less than 40% of the excess calories. So the rest of them were burned off, essentially. And the range was like 6% to 70%, I think. Some people retained most of the calories. Some people retained essentially none of it, even though they were all eating the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is, the point I want to make here, that I'm making in an excessively long way, is that only a fraction of those excess calories are retained during conditions of substantial overfeeding. And so going back to the carbohydrate versus fat comparison studies, it's the same thing there. They're only retaining a fraction of the calories. However, the fraction that they retain is the same whether they're overeating fat or carbohydrate. Now, I don't want to overinterpret these results, and I want to specify something just because I know your background and some of the people in the audience. These studies did not test overfeeding in a very low carbohydrate scenario. So they were kind of high fat situations, but it was not like a ketogenic type of scenario. So that remains an unknown, exactly what would happen during overfeeding in that type of a scenario, whether or not there would be some kind of different reaction that would occur.
Mm-hmm.
But we know a lot about what happens in the kind of intermediate zone, from kind of fairly low carb to high carbohydrate, and the evidence that we have suggests that it really makes no difference where the calories are coming from in that range.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And for you, does well, obviously quality controls quantity, in terms of all of that, and kind of, is that where you start, as when you're kind of giving out advice? Do you start more with the quality and then kind of the quantity takes care of itself, or do you firstly, quantify how many calories this person should be eating, and then you create the diet from there, and decide how much quality it should be in there, for instance?
Well, let me put it this way. I don't think any one of my ancestors for the entire history of Homo sapiens has ever counted calories. And most of their ancestors have never counted calories either. We are capable of counting calories. We're clever creatures, but we're not really set up. We're not designed to have a spreadsheet and quantify everything that goes into our mouths and every calorie that leaves from physical activity and balance it that way. We are endowed with energy regulating systems that are designed to balance the spreadsheet for us unconsciously. So the question is, how do you design an environment that leads to that energy balancing functioning well, functioning correctly, and balancing your spreadsheet in a way that is to your liking? And so to me, I don't want to knock people who count calories. Some people do it and it works for them.
Mm-hmm.
And if it works for you, then that's great. Everybody tries to find the thing that works for them, and I would never criticize someone who's doing that if it works for them. But I just don't think that's the way that our brain works. The way that our brain works is that we eat the food that's available, and we eat it until we're full, and then we stop eating. And so food quality for me is where it's at.
Mm-hmm. It's paramount.
Putting food, pardon?
It's paramount, is what I was saying, yeah.
Yeah, and so putting food in front of yourself, that's going to lead to an appropriate calorie intake. And of course, quality makes a big difference for the health effects of that food as well, outside of its body weight effects.
Yeah.
That's not really what we're discussing, but I just want to acknowledge that. But I also, it's not just about the food. That's one thing that I think is really important, is it's not just about the food that you have in front of you. It's also about your food environment. So how is that food presented? How easy is it to get? So for example, if I took the same, let's say a really healthy meal, let's say I took, some a piece of meat and a nice salad and a baked potato, something that I would consider at least a healthy meal. Now, that may be healthy at a sitting for dinner, but if you had that in front of you all day, you would probably, literally like within arm's reach, little pieces cut up so you could just put it right in your mouth, you would probably end up eating a lot more than if that was only in front of you at mealtime. And that's been confirmed many times.
Mm-hmm.
When food is easy to get and when the cost is low, the cost in terms of effort as well as money, we are wired as opportunistic eaters, and we will take advantage of those opportunities. And we don't have to take advantage of them. We do have willpower, but willpower is a finite resource, and it's difficult to exert it on a continual basis all day, especially when you're when you have more important things to do with it, like you're at work and you have other important things to do with your willpower. So just things like, having a box of donuts at a meeting, having a little bowl of Hershey Kisses or M&Ms at work, having a bag of chips on your counter, having ice cream in your freezer, even just having a fast food restaurant on your walk home that you smell every day, that's a food cue.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at advertisements on the television that are cueing your mind to desire those foods or to at least consider them. Those are all things that contribute. So while I think the quality of the food is very important, I think that the food environment is equally important, if not more important, at determining how much you're going to end up eating.
Mm-hmm. And the quality of the food as well, right? So that's going to determine what food choices you do make. Because if you are surrounded by fast food restaurants, I live in East London, and I can't remember the statistic, but there's 5 fast food restaurants on every single street, pretty much. It's absolutely crazy, and there's the highest prevalence of obesity within London, in East London itself. That's historical as well from the 1900s, but that's another story. Yeah, it is. It's sort of that food environment causes sort of these bad food choices, which obviously impacts on the quality and the quantity as well. And this is where I want to bring it, Stephan, is that although we might not all agree on all of the mechanisms and things like that, our solutions are almost similar, we want people to eat real food, and when you're eating that real food, whether it be high carb or low carb, because I know that you went recently to Dr. McDougall's study weekend, wasn't it? And that's a great blog post, by the way. It's really fascinating.
Thank you.
It's all good. As long as you're eating real food that's giving you real health, and the quality of that real food is going to sort out the quantity in itself, and hopefully everybody will become healthier. How does that sound?
Yep, I can get on board with that.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a real pleasure having you on, Stephan. Absolutely fantastic, and it's always good to sort of meet people face to face, wherever they are in the world, and talk about all of their ideas and the evidence that they've seen and created as well in your case. And I highly recommend everybody watching and listening heading over to Stephan's blog, wholehealthsource.org, and if you want to find out even more information from Stephan, I recommend grabbing his book as well, giving that a read, and you can buy that from Amazon UK at smashthefat.com/SGUK, or from the Amazon US store, smashthefat.com/SGUS. And people can follow you, Stephan, on Twitter at WHSource. Is that right?
Yep, that's correct.
Awesome. Were there any other passing words of wisdom that you'd like to impart with my listeners and viewers, Stephan?
No, I don't think so.
I think we've pretty much covered it, right? Again, thank you so much for your time today. It's greatly appreciated.
Okay, my pleasure.
Hopefully we'll get you back on the show soon, and talk about anything else that's up and coming.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, bud. Oh, and there's one more thing to do, in fact, and that's to shout, smash it out to the camera. I'm getting everybody from Eric Westman to who else was there? Mark Sisson out to the camera for our 100th episode. So on the count of 3, if you shout, smash, go on.
What am I supposed to shout?
Smash it out.
Smash it out.
Yeah, that's it, man. So
right.
On 3, 1, 2, 3.
Smash it out.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephan. I really, really appreciate that. That's cool, man. Well, thanks again, Stephan. Everybody, head over to wholehealthsource.org. biochemistry.org. And Stephan, thanks again. I'll see you soon, mate.
All right, thanks, Sam.
Cheers, man.
Okay.